Hello, I'm Judith Panero, Executive Director for AAMC and AAMC Foundation. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual discussion. We hope that you, our community of colleagues, allies, and supporters around the globe are healthy and safe. Our offices are in New York, and today I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn, location situated upon the unceded seized territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples, and benefited from the economies of slavery and labors of African-descended captives. We owe our existence and vitality to generations from around the world who were brought here against their will, drawn here to escape persecution, and some that have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. We pay respect to their communities past and present. This acknowledgement asks us each to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. The systemic violence and racism targeted at Black, Indigenous, and people of color is a harsh reminder of the inequities that persist in our society, particularly by the very institutions meant to protect them. AAMC condemns all violence, bias, aggression, and discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and religion. It is important to listen and learn together, and to also take action to make change a reality. AAMC's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access will continue to be a driving force of all our efforts. We call upon cultural organizations and the individuals working, funding, and serving them to take action to do better. We are dedicated to an environment in which all individuals are treated with respect and dignity at our programs. Each individual has the right to be in a professional atmosphere that prohibits discriminatory practices, including harassment. Our full code of conduct policy for this webinar and all our programs, as well as the outlets to make direct or anonymous report of violation, has been posted in the chat feature. For many years, we have been presenting virtual programming and documenting live events, all of which are accessible on our website at artcurators.org or our YouTube channel. We hope they provide actionable advice, value, and connectivity. You can also stay up to date on our programming by registering for our communications. We are grateful to all our attendees for making space in their schedule to join us. I also want to acknowledge our members here today and express our gratitude to them for their dedication in being part of our community. We give thanks to our speakers for sharing their experiences and knowledge in today's candid and open forum. Thank you again for joining us. And now to begin our program.
Hello. Hi, welcome everyone to this seminar, this webinar, I should say, where I'm delighted to be joined by a number of museum colleagues from around the world. Firstly, some shout outs to Judith and Monica at AAMC for convening this event. And I should say that this particular webinar is born out of an international engagement program that was funded by the Terra Foundation for American Art. The participants in that particular program were myself, April Watson, who's a curator of photography at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, Karina Corrigan, who is the H.A. Crosby Forbes Curator of Asian Export Art at the Peabody Essex Museum, and Clement, who is the Senior Curator of the Asian Civilization Museum. And as part of that program, we were tasked with coming up for a topic for discussion for one of these webinars. And I thank them for suggesting our panelists today. So I might suggest, firstly, that each of our panelists introduces themselves, and I'm going to suggest an order, just going clockwise on what I can see on my screen, which is Jovanna, and then Jeanne, and then Cherry. So please take it away.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. It was lovely to be asked, and the conversation, I'm sure, will be very interesting to be a part of. I am the Education and Public Engagement Manager at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, Canada, and formerly I was at the Royal Ontario Museum. I'd like to start by saying what a lovely introduction to this whole webinar we had. Where I live and work is in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. It's part of the Dish with One Spoon territory, and part of Treaty 13 with the Canadian government. And I think it's just so wonderful that all of our cultural institutions are really embracing this tradition of acknowledging the culture that came before us on the land where we live and work, because in our role as cultural interpreters and telling the narratives of different peoples in our cultural spaces, in our museums and galleries, it's really important for us to have a grounding in what came before and the different perspectives. So, it's wonderful to hear it really take hold in our industry. And, today, as we're talking about how we're interpreting art, it's my history in my career has been really about children and family programming and how to make learning accessible to as many audiences as possible. So I'm really excited to be part of this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Giovanna. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeanne Goswami. And I want to thank everyone and just say it's such an honor to be here speaking with my colleagues and sharing our experience with all of you who are here on this webinar with us today. A special thanks to Karina, Clement, April, Katy, and everyone at AAMC for organizing this and inviting me to be a part of it. And I also want to thank my fellow panelists, Jovanna and Cherry, for sharing their perspectives. Before we begin, I also want to acknowledge that I'm joining you here from Salem, Massachusetts, which is part of the unceded ancestral territory of the Pawtucket, Pennacook, Massachusetts, Nipmuc, Wampanoag, and many other people who have lived on and cared for this land for hundreds of generations. I acknowledge that my home exists because of the legacies of colonialism, slavery, displacement, and genocide that are at the heart of US history. And I wish to honor Indigenous communities past, present, and future, and their vibrant cultural legacies. As Giovanna said, I think being open to the idea that there isn't one narrative, but a series of complicated, interconnected narratives that have always been present in our cultural institutions, in our histories, is such an integral part of what interpretation is and what its best practices encompass. So I came to interpretation through curatorial and editorial work. I'm here on the panel today because I was Karina's interpretive partner on the Asian Export Art Gallery reinstallation at PEM that opened last year. But prior to my work at PEM, I worked for the Harvard Art Museums and also for the New Museum in various curatorial and editorial roles. I'm currently an independent consultant here in Salem, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of this conversation.
Thanks. And then Cherry, if we could ask you to introduce yourself as well. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for having me. So I'm very excited to share what we have done and also trying to do in Asia, in Singapore. So I'm from the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore, and I used to be an educator, so I have been with the museum for the past 10 years. So looking into education and also how to make exhibition more meaningful for people from different parts of the world and also children and adults. But recently, I'm also heading an access team. So we are looking into how to make museum more accessible and inclusive for people with disabilities, for seniors, and also for children with special needs as well. So I am very excited to also hear about what other people are currently doing in different parts of the world, and also look forward to hear your questions and your comments so that we could share more together. Thank you.
Thank you. And in the spirit of collegiality, I should introduce myself as well. I'm Katy Wan. I am an assistant curator at Tate Modern in London, have been for maybe the last 6 years. And so whilst I'm moderating the discussion, I hope that what I bring to the discussion is this kind of perspective of someone who works very closely with colleagues who work in the interpretation department of my museum. And actually just trying to understand from all of your international perspectives, how you work, and just thinking about interpretation as something really being beyond what I concede is primarily in our museum, wall-based text, leaflets, audio descriptions, and yeah, just seeing how it works, like a more expanded view of interpretation, I think is worth considering in this meeting. And I guess, yeah, I mean, we can't avoid the elephant in the room of how the global coronavirus pandemic is affecting the work of all of us across the museum in various different departments. But in terms of this discussion, how it's affecting interpretation as well. So I guess we should just get stuck in. And I think we already get an indication from your self-introductions that interpretation is not necessarily something that's confined to a department. We formulated some questions together, and I just want to also say, like, this is the first time I'm doing a webinar, and it's just a discussion between 4 of us. We really encourage those of you who are listening in to add your questions into the chat function. But otherwise, we'll kind of just treat it very much as a conversation between 4 kind of curatorial interpretation colleagues from around the world, just wanting to understand more about each other's approaches. So to kick us off, I think one of the first questions we were considering is I'm just curious to know, like, how do you approach interpretation in your practice? And are you part of a dedicated interpretation department? Or as I'm already getting the sense, like some of you were mentioning that you do work with families and with young people, how it traverses different responsibilities of the museum. I mean, speaking from my personal experience, I work for a huge museum, over 800 employees, so everyone's role is very highly defined. But I appreciate in smaller organizations that you are often required to multitask and apply your skills across different areas. And I'd be just curious to know, yeah, and maybe if at this point you want to cite kind of images or case studies that you even think about. I'd love how interpretation operates within the organizations that you work with. So not to put anyone on the spot, but I'm just gonna go with Jovanna first off.
All right, well, I'll kick this off. Well, so interpretation for me is, in the museum context, it's really about making stories accessible to people. So as you mentioned, I don't come from a curatorial background, although of course I'm quite interested in the content side of things. But it's really about being that interpreter between the knowledge and the learner. And my approach to it has always been very holistic, where ideally many people make up your exhibition team. And right now I'm in a smaller museum, mid-sized museum at the Aga Khan Museum. And it really does have this approach that, you know, you have a large group of people from many different departments, and we all pitch in. But even when I was at the Royal Ontario Museum, it's the largest museum in Canada, and yes, there is a department for interpretive planners, but I was able to be as the person who had the perspective of children and families. I was able to be a part of those exhibition teams, which was really wonderful because, you know, you're working with amazing designers and curators, interpretive planners who really get the language right, but then you're all kind of playing with these ideas of how we can get ideas across. So, you know, it's looking at multisensory experiences, it's looking at different perspectives and even different interests and different learning styles, so that, you know, you have one story, but people can access it in different ways. I don't know how, so interrupt me if I talk too long, because I know everyone else has their ideas too, but one experience that I thought was really helpful in thinking about interpretation, years ago when I was at the ROM, I was able to take a team of designers to the Ontario Science Centre and the Indianapolis Children's Museum, just as examples of how you can look at art. We were preparing for a Pompeii exhibit, and, you know, traditionally you would think that's a very adult kind of, you know, although volcanoes are awesome, but there was a lot of content that you would think would be really kind of more adult-like, but when you look at other museums and zoos and aquariums and all these different places, you can really see how to access that information, and it inspires what you do.
Yeah, right. It's making me think a lot of, I mean, in the work that I do, it's about communicating to lots of different audiences. And I think it can be a challenge when communicating to young visitors. I guess very weighty themes, like I guess when you're referring to this Pompeii exhibit, like death, like these natural disasters, and also recognizing that people come to museums for different reasons as well. I mean, as we're in the process of reopening, like what is the purpose of the museum? Is it a place for solace, for learning, for indignation? It's really like worth considering all of these points. I think Cherry, you also mentioned that you do a lot of work with families as well, and with younger people. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So what we're trying to do is making a museum for as a place to imagine. So, you know, like it is a safe place for children to imagine, to be imaginary, to be creative. So our job is to facilitate and scaffold that kind of process. You know, so learning facts is one thing, but the huge thing is, you know, the children are going to walk away from the museum remembering a very happy experience, be it making a very interesting craft that they bring home, you know, as a souvenir, or watch a play or performance, or even listen to a very interesting story. So I think these kind of experience will kind of carry them to adulthood, and more likely they are going to return to the museum. So at the Asian Civilizations Museum, when we have an exhibition, especially a special temporary one, so my colleagues will actually organize like a festival or a family fun program. So like a once a month, a Saturday, so family will come together to do crafts. So it's also like a bonding time for working parents as well as children. So they also, you know, take along their grandparents as well. So we want people to remember the family bonding time, a happy time. So apart from, you know, sharing the knowledge, I think this is the kind of feelings, the emotion that we want children to remember. And I also, because working with people with disabilities as well, and when we work with the volunteers and also the agencies on the ground, and they mentioned that museum is actually a safe place for them because it's indoor, you know, and they enjoy a cooling environment and it's quiet. So, I mean, to me, it was, we took it for granted. But when they shared that with us, I said, wow, we provided a safe environment for learning to take place. So to me, that is a very heartwarming statement.
Yeah, and really, really interesting. And it's like, I quite like what you said about almost the museum as being a place of refuge. And I can especially imagine on a practical note, being where you are in Singapore, like amazing to just get people through the door in the first place. Air conditioning, always great. But then how do you treat this as a holistic experience? Like once people are through the door, how do you engage with them and encourage them to stay there? I think there's something you mentioned as well that strikes me as this this wanting to encourage people to feel a sense of ownership over not only their heritage, but also, I mean, often museums are civic spaces, publicly funded. So I'm always feeling that we should, like, the public should feel comfortable in these spaces. And I think what both you and Giovanna are saying really rings true to the point of allowing people to feel like they can construct their own stories from these spaces and really relate to what they're seeing in front of them. On those kind of weighty themes, Jeanne, you said that you had worked with Karina within like her specialism of Asian export art, a very complex topic, and I guess you're trying to address different audiences as well. And sorry, just to relate it back to the earlier question about this kind of expanded view of interpretation, like, do you see parallels with this in your work as well?
Absolutely. And I think it's very important to note that interpretation will manifest itself physically very differently in different organizations based on size, resources, their mission, who they identify as the audiences they want to reach. So although there are many different ways visitors can interact with and experience interpretive elements, interpretive devices. I think it's important to understand that interpretive practice is always grounded in specific goals and specific ways of working both with one another's and with communities that enable us to help achieve what it is we're trying to do, which is open up museums to be welcoming spaces, but also challenging spaces to people of different backgrounds, different learning styles, different familiarity with the collections that we have. I'm part of an organization called the Association for Art Museum Interpretation, AAMI, which, much like AAMC, is a community of like-minded practitioners. And on their website, if you visit it, they'll state it much more eloquently than I'm going to shorthand it right now. But there are kind of these 5 principles for basing your interpretation practice of what all interpretation, regardless of how it manifests itself, tries to do. And one of the key things, of course, is what we've been talking about so far, which is creating multiple pathways for understanding. And those pathways should always value the objects within the collection that you're talking about, the visitor, and that particular museum's mission. And those should all 3 be on equal footing in order for that interpretation to be as successful as possible. It's also important to note that interpretive practice should always be grounded in rigorous evaluation. At the Peabody Essex Museum, we were blessed to have an absolutely dynamite head of evaluation, Bridget Devlin, who really helped Karina and I devise studies, focus groups to reach the communities we wanted to work with, to make sure that what we were saying were things that they were interested in hearing and were also informed by their own expertise and what they knew about their own cultural heritage and the legacies of the objects within our collection. Interpretation should also encourage audiences of all backgrounds, and particularly those who have been overlooked by museums and institutions in the past, to look at objects and to connect with their own lived experiences. It practices socially, intellectually, and physically accessible interpretation. So that goes to everything from our labels to any sort of digital interactives need to be accessible on all of those 3 levels to all of our audiences. And also, and this gets to the Asian Export Art Gallery particularly, it often challenges people to shift previously held perceptions of things through provocation, through play, through telling unexpected stories, or asking them to look at objects in new and different ways. And again, cut me off if I'm going over on my time, but one of the ways that we really tried to engage with these ideas in the Asian Export Art Gallery was through our interpretive plan of having our kind of meta goal of, if people walk away from this exhibition with only one idea in their heads, what do we want to make sure they walk away knowing? And as a team, through a process of collaboration and brainstorming, we came up with the idea that we wanted people to understand that our moment that we're living in now is not the first global moment, that globalization, that interactions, exchange, equal, unequal, good, bad, everything in between has been going on for centuries. And we wanted to use PEM-specific collections to give an example of another global moment and all of the repercussions and things that happened from that. And then from there, we established a series of visitor outcomes of what we wanted people to walk away with. And from there, that helped us to narrow down from the thousands of amazingly compelling stories that we could tell with Karina's collections, what it was we really wanted to focus in on and give people an opportunity to engage with on deeper levels to help them grapple with these ideas. We had an amazingly talented team of designers who we worked with, media specialists who helped us bring these ideas to life and really tried to create different experiences that were designed with specific audiences in mind. But what we found was when you design with that specific audience in mind, it usually winds up working better for everyone. And so a video, for example, telling the story of Augustus the Strong and his crazy mania for porcelain that we designed with like a 3rd grade school group audience in mind is funny and engaging for visitors of all ages.
I really love that idea of a meta goal. And I think that actually, even though this webinar is focused on interpretation, it's actually something that is pertinent to the work that we all do. I mean, it's funny, like speaking from my role, we have these implementation meetings for exhibition projects, and diversity inclusion comes up as an agenda point. But really, I think we should all be trying to integrate this as part of our work. I think, Jeanne, you had something to share, I think just before this meeting that we were discussing, but I'm just curious to know from Jovanna and Cherry, so slightly kind of wandering away from the questions that we had thought in the beginning, but it's almost like this idea of kind of approaching different audiences is something that we discuss a lot with our marketing teams, but is this something that you also have to do within your museums, like having that cross-departmental communication about the kind of audiences that you're expecting to come in? Or should we follow more of Jeanne's approach and just be like, let's just like hone in on one kind of audience and do it like super well, like have a really strong message?
It's a really interesting question, because I think you need a bit of everything. We definitely do research on who our audience is and who we expect to come. From an education and programming perspective, though, you're often called on to make the same exhibition accessible to different groups. So it might be a group of young students, it might be a group of seniors, it might be a group of people living with dementia, it might be a group of botanists who have come to do a tour of paintings with plants on them, and so you take that same exhibition and tell the different story, or tell the same story, because your exhibition has a message, but also use the artifacts to connect to whoever is coming through. And that's where I think having that kind of open thinking and experience from the traditional like curatorial exhibit design interpretation side, but also people who are working on the floor with visitors, and all together in one team when you're building things, because when you're creating an exhibition, and if you have people who are familiar with the questions visitors usually have when they come, and they can be out there or they're very familiar with the needs of teachers and what is in the curriculum. You have your meta goal, you have your story that you're going to explore in this exhibition, but there can be little hooks throughout to connect to various audiences. So, my approach is I like museums to be accessible to everyone rather than just targeting specific audiences. But I also think that having really authentic and long-lasting relationships with your community is important as well. So yes, you have really strong relationships within your institution, but then all of that community outreach that we should all be doing, I actually think it's not something that should be tucked off into the education and programs bailiwick.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
I think it actually should be integrated into everything that we're doing, because hearing the voices of the people in our community is actually what makes us relevant. If we're just this beautiful building with beautiful art, why are we important to society? And you can't just go out and say, oh, we're having an exhibition on the art of Iran in the medieval period, and just talk to them. You have to keep talking to them.
Of course, yeah. Maybe it's worth unpicking. So I know that Jeanne was talking specifically about like a specific age group for whom, but actually finding that people with like a more mature reading age could also really get those stories and get the humor, and it's a story that could resonate with lots of different groups. I think it's just going to be this perpetual challenge, which of course, Giovanni, you're right, we should always be aspiring to, which is addressing our diverse audiences. Cherry, how does this how do you approach this in your practice?
I think it's the same for us, that we're trying to make it accessible to different group of people. So I think in an exhibition planning team, we work very closely with colleagues from different departments. So just to make sure that we cover each other. So in the team, there's always be someone who is an access expert. So this person will always develop a close relationship and partnership with social service agencies that work with people with disabilities and seniors. And also another group of colleagues who will look at public programming. So this is, we are talking about general public who comes in to, like, we enjoy good performances and programs. So, and another group of colleagues will look into education, specifically for schools children. So when we talk about school also, we talk about preschool to all the way to high school and tertiary students. So we work with teachers to kind of make the content more relevant to schools and to their curriculum as well. So these are the experts I would call colleagues who have different expertise to come together to make the programs more holistic, to make sure that we reach out to the people as well. And I do agree that we have to work with the community. So sometimes, as much as we can, we will actually partner with schools, with community center to actually come up with programs as well. I mean, this co-creation part is actually quite important because, I mean, we work at the museum for a long time, but sometimes we wanted to know how to make our objects, our stories more relevant to individual, because that kind of helps to form the connection sometimes. And in order to do that, to foster that kind of relationship, we have to really reach out to more people and have more deep conversation.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's really reminding me really of quite a live situation that we have here in our museum, which is that, as I'm sure many other organizations do, we have various like diversity networks intended to give safe spaces and places for dialogue for people across different groups in the museum to, I guess, challenge things that they think, like challenge the forms of representation, challenge any forms of discrimination that they might feel are present. And I think that, like, yeah, to be honest, it's really difficult. Like, do you draw upon their knowledge, or do you recognize that as being an emotional burden to people who have to deal with these issues on a daily basis? Do you, like, I'm curious to know, like, in all your organizations that you talk about, groups that you consult with, are they remunerated for the advice that they give and the perspectives that they offer? Anyone feel free to jump in there.
I can speak from the example again of the Asian Export Art Gallery. And I think it's important to note that, like most institutions, you know, PEM is grappling with trying to have a more holistic and across the board approach to how they engage with communities. So it becomes less of a kind of one-off situation, and it becomes more about creating lasting relationships with communities locally in Salem, and also more broadly speaking, that they want to engage with. That being said, what we were able to do with the Asian Export Art Gallery was work both with a group outside the museum, which were Asian American educators in the Boston area who worked with students from 3rd grade all the way through college audiences. And so involved in that, we had a high school teacher, a 4th grade teacher, a community activist, 2 college professors, and others who we consulted with on a number of our planned deeper dive interpretive experiments. And we did compensate them for their time. We felt it was very important that for this not to be yet another burden on them to come in and educate us on their history, but rather a really a relationship that created a more level playing field between those of us within the museum and those of us outside who we were speaking with, for them to really be, to let them know that we valued their time, that they had something that we wanted them to contribute to this gallery that we wanted to see manifested within the gallery space. And, you know, the payment wasn't some huge amount, but it was important for us to value their time with some sort of compensation, because otherwise, I think you're right, Katy, it does become just yet another emotional burden that we place on people, and then kind of use their ideas without, you know, without necessarily calling attention to what they have brought to the project. And so in addition to compensating them, there's also a plaque within the gallery thanking all of them for their time and for the contributions that they made to help make this gallery space possible. And I do think that as museums start to bring this type of co-creation, collaboration, community engagement into the exhibition and installation making process, that those types of practices need to become kind of better established, so that there are these kind of expectations of, you know, what we're asking for from the communities we're engaging with and what we're giving to them in return, so that it becomes a much more transparent and fair relationship that people enter into knowing everything before it begins.
So
yeah, it's really exemplary. Sorry, Giovanna.
What we've done at the Aga Khan Museum is a bit of a mix. There have been occasions where we invite people in and they're compensated for their feedback. Usually it's academics or people who are recognized as knowledgeable in that area. But this is also where having good, deep relationships with communities can be very helpful. We tend to do a lot of outreach to community groups that is mutually beneficial in different ways. And so, you know, we might invite them in to do some free programming. And on the back end of that, they're also giving us some feedback. And so there's this constant relationship between various organizations in our community that, you know, we might reach out to them and say, we need some input on, you know, an audience of Afghan women, but then we'll be like, oh, hey, we're doing this program and we'd like to invite you to send some of your members for free. So that can be really useful in having those deep, long-lasting relationships in the community, but definitely you don't want to take advantage of people.
Thank you. I'm especially curious to hear from Cherry in that regard as well, because in the context where you are in Singapore, which is ethnically diverse, obviously we don't want to kind of generalize like the different types of kind of minority experience that there are, but are there different groups that exist within your museum to contribute? I mean, I think you touched on this before, to be fair, and like, how are they given some kind of compensation for? Yeah, sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's okay. I'm happy to answer that. So in our museum, our museum is a multiracial setting, that to begin with. So we have colleagues from all over the world, have different cultural backgrounds. So that actually helps because we first kind of create the internal dialogue to go through the content. We just want to make sure that we have fair representation in whatever that we do. And secondly, to be very sensitive of how we approach a sensitive topic as well. And thirdly, also each curator, they also go out and to engage with the different community group and also to seek and to share, you know, what this is important to them. So taking all these different accounts, and we come back together and we look at our materials and to just see that how we could best present the stories without compromising certain content as well. I think the most important thing is for the museum staff to first have that sense of respect and appreciation of other cultures and history. So, and I think started from that foundation, it kind of set us in the right tone to continue to learn more and to have that kind of frank conversation about the different ethnicity and also cultural background. So that kind of helped as well.
Can I say this is also a great reason to have a diverse workforce so that you have different perspectives in your museum already.
Great point. Thank you, Giovanna. I'm aware that time is pressing on. I know that April's got a question here, but I'd also encourage others who are listening in to add a question to the chat box. I feel that we might have addressed some of this. I mean, I think a lot of what we've been talking about has really been about audiences, about our communities, and actually something that we discussed in the kind of pre-meeting leading up to this webinar is how we are in this really interesting moment. Certainly, like in the context in which I'm working in London, our audiences are very we have a lot of tourist foot traffic, where Tate Modern is kind of like one of those destinations, and I can only imagine it's the case for you as well. But more and more now, I think we're needing to speak to our local communities and do more community outreach, fulfill the roles that we have as museums to our publics. But just to look at April's question here, she asks, what interpretive strategies do you use when presenting historical material that is titled using language or terminology we no longer deem appropriate, or that is even harmful, or that presents potentially offensive subject matter without censoring difficult or painful aspects of history? So I guess this speaks to the point of, I guess, so much of what's very live in the public discourse at the moment, I think not only within museums, but in public statuary as well. Do we just, how do we find a way to communicate what has happened and not celebrating these figures who have kind of wreaked harm and havoc upon whole groups of people? How do we actually bring that back into a question? Like, are you revisiting texts in the organizations that you work with? You're revisiting the kinds of pre-existing interpretation. I know that certainly is happening as part of a museum-wide project at the Tate Galleries, Tate Britain, Tate Modern, where the texts were written a long time ago. Like, is that something that you're coming across in your work? I'm going to go reverse order now and start with Cherry.
I'm actually trying to think very hard of an example. I think recently we have we had this exhibition called Raffles. And so I think it's about colonialism and the exhibition, and it kind of generate a lot of conversations about colonialism and how a certain community groups is actually felt, how do I say, a bit sad about the history. So I think what we have to do as a museum is to actually present that story to have, I mean, not to cover the truth as well, but it's actually to help each other to look forward, to what do we actually want to achieve out of what happened in the past, but how can we take that lesson to move forward. I think that is actually more important when we present that exhibition.
Thanks. Giovanna?
Well, I would say one example for us, being an Islamic art museum, we have art pieces that celebrate Muslim civilizations, diverse Muslim civilizations. And of course, there are many different faiths that are connected to that history. And so our approach really is to be transparent about who we are and what our purpose is, which is to celebrate the positive contributions of Muslim civilizations. And that's art created by people living under Muslim rule. It's not necessarily the art of Islam or the art of Christianity or the art of Judaism. And so it's important for us to present the information from an art perspective, from a secular perspective, and use the language that people would have preferred to use for themselves. But when I have educators bringing people through, it's always, at this time, Muslim people believe that X, Y, Z, because we want people to feel welcome, and we do get visitors who have one belief or another. they may believe that this is, holy text, or they may not believe, other people may not believe, and we want both of those audiences to feel welcome in the space. And so by approaching the artifacts as art pieces and talking about them in a secular way, both audiences can have their own connection to the art pieces without feeling like it's not for them.
And Jeanne?
And I'll use an example that picks up on the portion of April's question that speaks specifically to artworks that are titled using problematic language. And as part of my work at the Peabody Essex Museum, I was also an interpretive editor as well as an interpretive planner. And there is a show that opened last year on a Western photographer's views of China in the 19th century. And a number of the photographs were titled using what we now consider to be derogatory racial slurs. And we actually went through a pretty intense process with the curatorial team, the interpretive planner on the project, and myself, trying to come up with a way to acknowledge the historical title, call attention to the fact that we no longer find it appropriate without putting those words on the wall. And so the decision that we came to as a team was to replace the derogatory word in the title, place it in brackets with an asterisk with a much more neutral term. But then on the wall, there was a text explaining what those bracketed asterisk terms, why they were there and what they were doing. And so we were able to call attention to the fact that, in the past, these photographs have been referred to in a different way, in ways that we no longer feel are appropriate, in ways that we no longer want to perpetuate. Because by putting these words on the wall, yes, perhaps it's more historically accurate as to what the work of art has been known for in the past or known as in the past. But you always run the risk that if you put that on the wall with no context, no explanation, people are going to assume that you think those words are okay. And we now know that those words are not okay. And we have an obligation to state that we know these words aren't okay. And so as a way to not simply erase that history, but to acknowledge it without perpetuating it, that was the approach we took.
It's so difficult. And as you say, that kind of going back to our point about the diversity of audiences that come, I mean, we're talking about all types of different diversity, like diversity of attention span as well. So maybe people just stroll in without necessarily reading the disclaimer at the front but yes, like you say, I think it's really important to be providing those two different levels of information. So I'm just mindful of bringing other people into the conversation. We've got quite a few questions here. I think there was an interesting question from Catalan, and I apologize in advance for getting any pronunciations wrong, but Catalan also brings up the point about the Raffles exhibition and to what extent I think consultation was involved in that. I think they raised the point that there was no there was only one side of the story, but no presence of the story of the natives' view on Raffles. So yeah, interesting. I mean, I think that, and as also exhibitions, like once they're no longer on, they continue to have this life beyond their physical presence in the gallery, don't they? And they become part of museums' histories as well. Excuse me, I have my glasses, so I'm squinting at the camera. Mick Billingsley asks, how, if at all, is interpretation changing, surviving the traditional institutional and systematic powers while serving them? I guess this is, if I understand it correctly, relates to the voice, this kind of authoritative voice of the museum. And maybe it's worth just bringing in, I think we wanted to say a little bit about technologies, but both, could you say something both about like the voice, this kind of like disembodied voice of the museum, but also whether technology is helping at all in these endeavors? I'm going to start with Giovanna this time.
When I read this question, it's less about technology and more about, you know, kind of that ivory tower authoritative voice and role. But I think interpretation is more about, you know, an experience rather than a hierarchy of who communicates the information. So I think it's going to survive. It's just a question of how it evolves to remain relevant. And you know, maybe someone else can speak to the technology. You know, technology is a really useful tool for all that we do, but sometimes it's useful and sometimes it's just technology for technology's sake. So I actually think it's important to really think carefully about when it adds to the experience. You know, if you've got a manuscript and you can't see all the other pages, it can be really useful. But sometimes it can interrupt the experience, especially when it keeps crashing all the time. So
yeah, I was probably using technology as a real catch-all, like a word for everything. But maybe I was thinking of okay, like audio guides in the space. I think you can often, that's quite a helpful way to bring in like literal voices, like different curators, different people who've worked on the exhibition.
Yeah, and
people like in the community.
I'm sure Cherry has lots to say with the accessibility. You know, how can you help people who learn visually or need sign language, or, you know, so many ways to enhance the visitor experience and have the visitor choose what experience they want. So yeah, I'm quite excited to see, especially now with COVID reality, how we all adapt. And I think we're all adapting much faster than we usually do. You know, it's that whole, it takes a long time to turn a large ship, but all of a sudden we're like, okay, we've turned. So
yeah, I agree. It's definitely wrenched us more into like the future of technology, like perhaps sooner than we had either wanted or anticipated. Perhaps Jeanne, do you, actually like to speak to Cherry. Yeah, I mean, obviously this relates directly to your work about creating these different interpretive experiences for your visitors. How to make it non-hierarchical, and is that even a desire at your museum?
I think recently we have created an audio description tour, but slightly different from the traditional one. We actually complement it with videos as well. So it actually also helped sighted people to enjoy and to also look at items or the objects more in details. So with that in mind, we also trying to create something that is more universal. So it's not just for one group of people, but it's also have the potential to reach out to more. So that is one. And the second thing I also like to talk about is learning style as well. I think we talked about that earlier on, because what we realize is that there are different motivations, people with different motivations when they come to the museum. Because some of them, they want to spend time with people. So that is like being a facilitator role. Another kind of person who just want to be recharged. Another person would be just trying to seek new experience. And you have researcher and you have someone who trying to just explore what is the interesting things in the museum. So when we look at interpretation, we also look at the motivation. How do we serve their motivation? So for example, if a mother comes into the museum with a daughter and she doesn't know anything about the museum, how do we come in to provide that kind of intervention to help her to have a good time with the daughter? And also another example would be someone who can't see the artwork but prefer to have someone to talk to the person, to have like an active conversation. So we also have that visitors as well. And we also have another group of people who like to make things. So I would like to cite an examples that we have in a recent exhibition. It's called the Guopei, Chinese Art and Couture. So it's about fashion, it's about beautiful gowns and the workmanship. So we actually created an interpretive corner. I mean, what we want to call it is activity zone. So in that activity zone, we make different kind of activities. Someone that, a place for people to read books, just to recharge, look at different design books. And one corner is to look at videos, a conservation technique. But the most interesting thing is this center where we encourage people to try sewing. But we have this huge needle and like a mesh, you know, instead of tiny embroidery patterns, we make it like a big ones. So we see people from all ages come together and try to make their patterns on the piece of cloth. And we also have tiny mannequins with different pieces of felt where people can put together to make their outfit. So what I want to say is that this zone becomes like an active learning space for people who have different learning styles, and whether or not they have disabilities, but there's at least something for everyone to do there. So what I wanted to stress is that first we need to look at provide different multisensory materials for people to engage with, and also to look at their motivations.
Can I just like to add on to what Cherry's saying. Those zones can be fantastic, but I would also challenge people to look at how they can incorporate those experiences throughout the exhibition. We did that with great success in the Pompeii exhibition, and you know, these experiences that oftentimes people associate with children when they're stuck at the end in a zone can be really powerful when they're right next to the artifact that you're talking about. And that's really great for intergenerational groups and conversation, because, you know, someone who's really interested in looking at the artifact and reading the label can be in the same group as someone who just wants to look at a thing, make their own meaning out of it, and then try to sort things on an interactive table. And really, when we've had like dress up activities, the adults are doing it just as much as the kids. And when you space those out throughout the exhibition, it gives you a different kind of vibe throughout the exhibition, and people are engaged throughout. It's not just this kind of like walking through looking.
It's so interesting time and again. I think we're all familiar with like the children's play area at the end. And yeah, really interesting to think how we could integrate that more into the overall experience of the exhibition.
And it can be quite classy when you do that. Right?
Yeah, right. And not like something that's just like bright colors, and or even if it is, I think it's fine.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's an important thing to touch upon too. Like, interpretation should never be something that is an add-on at the end, or feel like it has its one zone, but it doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the exhibition, because the best interpretive approaches are always the ones that are seamlessly woven into the fabric of the exhibition throughout the experience. Before we move on, just to take Mick's question in a slightly different direction, I do think, you know, especially in the United States, we're seeing systemic power within institutions being called into question across the board currently. We see it from San Francisco to Louisiana, Virginia, Detroit. And what I will say is, you know, interpretation, like anyone within a museum, is only as good as it finds ways to accomplish what it needs to do to bring audiences in the door, to make more people feel welcome. And that often requires working within power structures that we know aren't fair, aren't equal, aren't just. But finding ways to accomplish what we need to accomplish by finding allies within curatorial, within design, within the various departments of the museum, who all share our vision for what we want our institutions to be, and to try and change those things from the ground up to the extent that we each have the power and the ability to. And I honestly think we owe that to our audiences. And if we want more people to trust us, more people to come to our institutions, more people to see us as places where they feel welcome and where they see their histories embraced and shared and valued, then we do have to be willing to do that work, even when we feel as though it's an uphill battle.
Thank you. All really important points. So I'm just looking at some of the further questions that have come in. So far we've been talking about like interpretive planning, but of course interpretive, like evaluation of interpretive planning is also really important. I'm delighted to see in the Q&A that there's kind of like mini like responses from participants, from other attendees of the webinar. Emily Stone asks, what methods do you use to test your interpretation? For which I think Bridget has answered. Bridget Devlin, who I think is a colleague of yours, Jeanne. Shout out to Bridget. And Bridget says that they've worked with you as evaluation planner as prototype and to test interpretive approaches for the Asian Export Art Gallery. So I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that, Jeanne, like how you see your work in practice, and I guess what we're working towards is seeing these things working.
Mm-hmm. And I think, it's important to think of, evaluation throughout the process. So, so often museums, I feel museums have embraced perhaps summative evaluation more than they've been able to adopt things like formative evaluation, prototyping, and strategies that can inform what we're building before we've actually built it. And so to the extent that we're not just asking people, what did you like about this experience? What did we get right? What did we get wrong? That can then, yes, inform what we do next. But to the extent that within our practice, we can build in the time to say, we want to build this amazing thing, but let's create a cardboard mock-up of it and actually run it by people and see if they think what we think is an amazing thing is actually an amazing thing. And so we had the ability to do that with one of the main experiences within the Export Art Gallery. And maybe now if it's okay, I'll just share my screen and you can see a walkthrough of what we actually
end up great
building. So this, let's see, share screen. So this is a view of, let me back up here. So part of the export art collection is a set of 18 panels of Chinese export wallpaper that we installed as a room within the gallery. It takes up 1/4 of the overall gallery space. And our goal was to create what we called an unperiod room. The idea that we weren't faithfully recreating the room in Scotland where this wallpaper was installed by the person who commissioned it, but giving a sense of what it would feel like in a room and telling the story of the gentleman who commissioned it, how it went from China to Scotland, as well as providing traditional didactic information, a hide and seek activity for intergenerational groups to participate in together, and also creating this kind of sense of ambiance with the digital fireplace and everything that you saw. And so obviously something like this takes a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of energy by numerous peoples with various expertise on the team. So before committing to doing this, we created a 2-scale mock-up of the space using digital reproductions of the wallpaper, creating handwritten mock-ups of the didactic labels, putting just 2 chairs that we pulled from our museum lobby in front of a cardboard fireplace, just to give people a sense of this is a down and dirty rough cut of what we're thinking of doing. Come walk through the space and tell us what you think about it. And from the feedback that we got from people, being able to time and track how much time they spent in the space, what they thought of it, what they thought was missing, what they wanted to know more about, what they weren't understanding about what we were trying to convey, it allowed us to create a final product that was much, much better than it would have been if we hadn't had the opportunity to do that. So it both confirmed that the overall idea was a good one, But in order to get us to something that people really enjoyed and wanted to spend time in, we needed to spend a lot of time tweaking the details.
Yeah, and I guess that's interesting that dwell time is something that we use so much in our practical considerations about moving people through the space. I'm working on an exhibition at the moment with a lot of moving image, and we're constantly being asked, like, how long will people spend there? But actually, I think the way in which you're describing it, we could deploy that information for thinking about, like, how engaged are people with the artworks and the art objects they're seeing in front of them.
And it was really, you know, as an example, we hypothesized, we speculated, people will spend, if they spend 90 seconds in this space, in the prototype space, we'll be thrilled. And within a space that was just a cardboard mock-up, the average dwell time was between 4 and 5 minutes. And so, you know, finding out something like that allows you to think differently about the space too. Like, oh, if people are going to spend this much time there, we need to make sure it's comfortable for people to be spending that much time there. We need to provide seating. We need to provide, you know, more information. We need to find a way to actually move people through the space so that they do leave eventually. These types of questions, when you're able to actually see what you assume tested in real time, and to have the ability to tweak it before you've invested all of the time, money, and energy in building the real thing, was hugely, hugely valuable.
And the nice thing is, when you've taken the time to do these prototypes and learn about the visitor patterns, when you find something that works, you can repurpose it in future exhibitions. So I know we're all strapped for time and resources and people and spaces in the museum to actually prototype things, but it's really well worth it.
Yeah, and it feels like all of these are having these dialogues as well, all goes towards, like you say, it's an investment of time. It requires a lot of people to contribute, but at the end of the day, like, hopefully this can make our processes more efficient, and for us to gain a better understanding of how we kind of move forward, and like what a future would look like.
Yeah, right. The prototyping process is also an experience for the visitor that they can enjoy and feel invested in what the museum is creating. And so when they come and they see the final product, they can say, oh, well, I contributed to figuring out how to do this, and they feel like it's their museum.
Thanks. We are approaching the end, but I just want to squeeze in. I want to ask Cherry, like, this question of interpretive planning evaluation, of like after the fact, thinking about like whether that's something that you it forms part of your work in understanding like how successful, if that's the word to use, your interpretive planning has been. And then I think after that we were going to return to Catalin's question as well. But do you want to say something about the evaluation of the interpretation that you've worked on?
Yes, I think it's also a cycle. So we have a post-mortem meeting. So we will talk about, so we have different colleagues from different departments come together to discuss what has gone wrong and what has gone well. So we take that into consideration. So for the next time when we do planning, we will learn from those mistakes and learning point, so that we will incorporate that into our planning as well. So, and also as a response to the prototyping as well, when we create products or interpretive materials for people with disabilities, we always let them go through in different and every stage, in fact. So just to get a very honest feedback. Actually, a lot of times we actually learn so much from them, like the way they interact with materials, the way they understand. Actually, most of the time, it just even come down to the choice of words and how to simplify that, and also to make instructions more understandable. So I always feel that the process is very beneficial, just to have that involvement from the people who are going to use your materials.
Thank you. And then, yeah, like I said, we didn't want to overlook this very important question about museum stances towards colonialism. And I think this question from Catalin applied specifically towards the Raffles exhibition. And obviously, just a disclaimer, that's not something, it's not an exhibition that you curated or proposed yourself. But I just wondered whether you had something further you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, so I was away for that exhibition, so I'm trying to understand from the team as well. It's actually a very tough question, I would admit, and in fact, it would be very difficult to discuss in detail via this webinar. But I think, in short, there are many parties involved, and we have to negotiate a balanced view and a balanced approach that is also acceptable. And we also foresee that it is going to be a controversial topic as well. Well, it may not be the perfect approach, but we learn from every exhibition. So that kind of help us to to improve on our approach in the next future exhibition. But I just want to give another point as well. From what I understand is there are some of the issues are also discussed quite critically during the conference and also in a catalog as well. So I think we try to open up different platforms for people to contribute and to hear, from their concern, also to try to engage with that conversation. So exhibitions is one platform, but we do have other platforms as well.
Thank you for that, Cherry. Goodness, in the 3 minutes we have left, maybe we can tackle, maybe I can try and attempt to wrap a couple of questions into one. I think Cindy Kang, hey Cindy, has a really interesting question about not only language, I think also, just to read out her question, she asks, have you had any experiences inviting community members to write labels that are presented alongside or instead of institutional labels? And I think it goes back to our point about the different voices, institutional voices, and perhaps having something outside of that. And then she adds on to that, and in multiple languages, the language of the communities. I think that point about different languages is super interesting. But yeah, I kind of like, we've all been talking about expanded forms of interpretation. Is this something that any of you have worked on, something that complements the kind of the normal didactics that you'd find in the gallery?
I would say I haven't been part of an exhibition that actually put labels written by other community members next to the curator's labels. But I have been part of a project where we had kids from our summer camp go through our Forbidden City exhibition, and they created their own interpretation on video. And so they gave video tours and reviews of what the stories were all about and what was important to them. And there was a whole other program with kids picking their favorite galleries and writing their own stories in the galleries. And that's where I think even when you're not able to do it in the text or official interpretation in the gallery space, there are many ways to incorporate those voices. And that's why having that holistic approach to the visitor experience when they walk in the door, what they eat in the restaurant, the music in the lobby, the exhibition, and the suite of programs that go along with the exhibition, that's where you can do that. But I know that there are many museums that have successfully put complementary labels in their exhibitions, and it's always wonderful to see.
Yeah, it's making me think, that question's making me think of the Alain de Botton's intervention at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which is a historic collection of artworks. And I feel like a lot of my colleagues kind of roll their eyes when I mention it, because I think there were really mixed responses to it. But this tied into, I guess it was like tied in with the publication of this book, Art as Therapy. And so there were these big kind of like post-it note type labels expressing feelings and emotional responses to certain artworks. Maybe the visual intervention was a bit too much for some people.
I think it goes to the point that there's, different people like different things, different learning styles like different things. Certain people are always going to want to have that more fact-based museum label. But I will say that, as we talk about bringing communities in, sharing authority, getting rid of that kind of disembodied museum voice, I think community labels, I think labels contributed by artists, by other members outside of the museum is a really important strategy not to overlook just because certain people have strong reactions to it. And I will say, for a special exhibition that the Peabody Essex Museum did, Jacob Lawrence's Struggle series, they did a publication that asked school-age children to respond to the panels within the series, which was, looking at American history through a different lens. And the publication has some really, really amazingly powerful responses to these artworks by school-age children of various backgrounds. But not everybody picks up the publication. We put it in the gallery in chat and relax areas, but some people either aren't going to notice it or aren't going to pick it up, certainly aren't going to buy it in the shop. And so just thinking, how powerful would it have been for more people to be able to encounter those type of responses within the actual physical framework of the exhibition space. And so remembering that, we always think that we have these different channels through our conferences and our catalogs and our websites, but if it's not immediately present and easily visible within the exhibition, many, many people are going to miss it. And so how can we take some of these strategies and make them more visible and give more people an opportunity to engage in different ways and with different voices?
Jeanne, you're reminding me of what we've done outside of as you go through the gallery, but we like to do something at the end of our exhibitions where people can respond to what they've seen, and I'm actually going to show you some pictures if I can do this.
Please do.
So we had some beautiful responses in our Syria, A Living History and Syrian Symphony exhibitions. And these were exhibitions that came together quite quickly when the Civil War was starting in 2016. And so this one was quite beautiful. And when we're talking about language too, when we brought these exhibitions out, we invited community members to actually help us translate a tour that they could bring around with them in Arabic, because we didn't have anyone on staff. So we were able to get the community to help us translate. And so there were portions in Arabic as well, but the power of an image in addition to a text can be quite beautiful. And what we asked visitors to do as they left was to select these little cards of the emotion that they had when they left the exhibition and invite them to just tie them to these really like ribbon panels. And this is just, partway through, but it ended up completely covered in these emotions that people left. And it was quite powerful. And the one that we saw the most was hope. So that was, it gave us all goosebumps when we did it. And that was really people building the response in the space. And just at the end, this was in our Syria Living History exhibition, and people, sorry, I flipped them. This is Syrian Symphony. But they could leave their comments on the walls and their messages of memory and hope. And again, it was people interpreting the experience and leaving their own impressions.
Thank you. That's a really uplifting note, I think, and maybe one that's worth concluding the webinar on. Thank you so much. I don't know if any of you have anything to add just before I do some kind of closing remarks. Really, it's been so fascinating to hear about your personal experiences, and it makes me realize that my understanding of interpretation is so narrow. I don't know if it's because of the organizations you work on. Your roles are so have such a diverse range of responsibilities with them, but I think it's just super encouraging to know that this kind of shared desire amongst colleagues around the world to be inclusive as possible to acknowledge the contributions of those who make our museums, who make the interpretation what they are. And I've certainly got lots of takeaways from these, from our discussion, like whether it's thinking about the different zones of the exhibition, the meta goals, I really love that, and the prototyping process, and how we can really challenge the idea of an authoritative voice, always be having that present in our minds as we do our interpretive planning as we move forward. I'm sorry we weren't able to get around to all of the questions, but it's an incredibly rich topic, and I think that it could have gone in all sorts of different directions. Thank you so much to Jeanne, to Giovanna, to Cherry. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. And yeah, to all of you who took the time to listen, and thank you so much. We hope you found it enjoyable and enlightening. Take care, everyone.
Hello, I'm Monica Valenzuela, Program Manager for AAMC and AAMC Foundation. Thank you for joining our program today, and a special thanks to our speakers for sharing their experience and expertise with us. A recording will be available on our website, artcurators.org, and our YouTube channel shortly. Please help support our capacity to continue programs such as today's event by making a donation today. A gift of any amount will have a direct impact on our work. Thank you, stay well, and join us again soon.